Welcome to Agilists on Agile. Today we've got Dave Witkin, Peter Borsella, and myself, Ernesto Custodio. This is a forum where we get to talk about some of the highlights that we've experienced in recent times and some of the hot Agile topics. So with that, I want to segue into some of the potential topics that we could pick today. Anyone have any suggestions? Dave, Peter?
I think one of the things we could talk about that I think it might be a great topic is sort of transformation models, specifically Agile transformation models, and how we might take and use some leading change management models and apply those to, I guess, an Agile context. And we specifically, in the past, I know we've talked about Cotter. It's something I know at least you and I are fairly familiar with his model.
Right, and the reason why we have the grin is we were just talking about it right before we press record, and that's the challenge that the models are great for guidance, but oftentimes when the rubber meets the road and we're talking about implementation, we're kind of left with our own practices and techniques. So it's a good discussion in terms of how do we apply that into actual transformations, into Agile implementations that lead to change, right? Going from something that has 8 steps as a general model, it's different than what are the actual steps in each of those phases that are going to make an impact for our clients or for anyone looking to adopt Agile. Okay. And Peter, I see you shaking your head there as well.
Yeah, and I think if I could use Cotter as an example with leading change, because what I found is, regardless of the model that you're considering, for me, my experience has always been the first step. As the biggest obstacle, the biggest challenge. When I think about Cotter's first step. So this is my own rewording, right, of Cotter. And what I extract from his approach is, an organization is going to want to change if one or two things is happening, right? So one thing is they're desperate. Right, they're on a burning ship, right? They have to do something. The sense of urgency, this agreed upon sense of urgency, and the other is like visionary leadership, right? Like, hey, we're at the top of the game already, but we think we can do more. Let's go to the next level, the next step. And I think in both of those cases, it requires a decent dose of leadership, right? Because in the first one, even being able to understand the possibility that we're in a desperate situation, that in itself could take some leadership insights and to communicate that to others.
You're referring to, so, and by the way, for clarity of those that might be listening, we're referring to Carter's 8 steps of progress toward leading change, right? Dr. John Carter that published the book Leading Change. And the first step in there is creating a sense of urgency, right? The one you just touched on, Peter. How do we verbalize why we're doing this? What is our problem statement, right?
Right. I think that's I was just referring to that as one example of what you and David just mentioned. Like, yeah, but how do you fill in those pieces now to get to that alignment, to get to that agreed upon state where yes, we need to do something different. That's the real challenge, I think. Not to dismiss Cutter's work. I mean, I think it's challenging enough to just accept and process a possibility of such a program, but those details of actually applying it locally, maybe that's why we're here. Right?
Yeah, and I do think that's significantly important. So one example, right? An organization I was involved with, we had a transformation, and it was assumed that everyone understood why we were doing this. And later on, with active coaching, we found that many of the team members thought, well, this is so you can get productivity, so half of us can get downsized, right? Wrong approach if you want a successful transformation, and you certainly want to get those things out of the way. So you present what is it you're trying to solve as step one, and you make sure that there's buy-in behind that, right?
Well, I wonder if that gets into a little bit, playing off of what you and Peter just said, is how do you measure a sense of urgency? So, or any of these other steps. One of the things that I know, Ernesto, we've talked about is, there's some general guidelines, but what are the indicators? If we're going to bring it down to the next level, what are the indicators that and I think the steps are not necessarily sequential, right? But what are the steps, or what's the indicators enough that, look, we're in pretty good shape here, and we are ready to start tackling some of these other areas? Because if you don't have, maybe you're going to build that sense of urgency, and through that guiding coalition, another step in the process. But at the same time, you have to start with enough where it's going to have momentum, so that guiding coalition actually has some legs, and people are going to put money behind it, those types of things. And I think, Ernesto, we were saying, we don't currently, or I've never seen a model that had a good set of indicators to say, if you're seeing X, you may be ready to move on to Y. And if you don't, you should probably hesitate and think twice before moving on, because you may be throwing good money after bad.
Yeah, that's a great point, right? So each of these have potentially an entry and an exit, right? And what are the criteria for each? How do you know that you are now ready to go from that, creating that sense of urgency, right? What is the output there? Well, that might be a problem statement that everyone aligns behind, right? And then that becomes the entry criteria for the next step, which is creating a powerful coalition. But you kind of need some inputs into that, right? Maybe understanding the decision makers that are necessary in that coalition. What level of guardrails do you want in that? How many are you targeting, right? Because you could have a coalition of 100 people, but we know that dilutes over time very easily. So that's not a good number. And then what are the things that you're going to look for in that process? And then the output of that is a group of individuals who are going to own the transformation, right?
A big missing piece of the puzzle, metrics, right? So what are you measuring? What has led you to the conclusion, right, that something needs to change? Like you said, I don't know if there's a scale, right, where you can check boxes and say, yes, we're ready to move it. But you've probably encountered situations where someone will say, hey, well, we have to improve our output. We have to improve our quality. Like, okay, well, show me your current quality metrics. I'm like, wow, we just know things aren't good, right? So, okay, maybe we need to dig in a little deeper first.
Well, and I wonder if that's part of that quote change story, right? Building, again, you talked about it, Peter. The most important step in a lot of ways is that first one, making sure that we do have a good story, metrics based or emotionally based, whatever it is. Because some customers will say their story is yellow taxi. We just got put out of business, by, or another taxi cab company by Uber, right? Maybe they don't have metrics, but that might be enough of an emotional appeal. Or we often talk about, missed opportunities that Xerox, that Microsoft took, or Apple took. Things like that, I think, might also be, it's different. It's not a numerical, we've seen our customer base erode by 20%. Which I think could also be something fantastic. But it just strikes me that a second way to build that credibility is, as much as we're still, I think many of us believe we're story-oriented animals, is to come up with a great story that suggests that the criticality of change.
One of my key areas to understand when I'm engaging in a transformation is what are the criteria for success? What does success looks like? How are we going to evaluate whether we're being successful or not? I think it goes back to your point, Peter. We first need to know where we were in order to know where we're going, right? And if we're not measuring some of the things that are supporting that problem statement, we are not going to know if we're making progress. It's going to be very qualitative in nature and maybe deceiving in some cases, right? And Dave, I like how you wrap that around on it being a set of steps that relate to creating a climate for change, right? The idea that we're talking about creating the urgency, the powerful coalition, and maybe the vision and the change factors that we're going to look at are part of that foundational set of steps, right?
Be part of the challenge, or so it struck me as we were talking through and talking in terms like entry and exit criteria. There's almost a little bit of a waterfall flavor to that approach, right? And as Agilists, I think we all want and expect to iterate, but there probably still needs to be enough. Maybe there's that MVP for some of these phases or some of these stages where we just don't even try to move on to the next one, even on a small scale. Maybe that's not the case either. I admit I'm of mixed mind. I haven't really thought that through, but I've just seen a lot of cases where people want to move on, right, to next steps, and they haven't built that solid foundation. And to Peter's point, those end up in many of the ones that I've seen do end up in trouble. And I'm trying to figure out how to wrap myself around that while still maintaining an agile approach to this.
Solve the waterfall part very easily. We just turn it into a wheel and put an arrow going around.
Sure, that's right.
But it's
those objectives, like, well, if we can get 20 teams using Scrum, then we've met our objective, something like that. I'm like, yeah, great. They're doing a good job.
And you hit on a point that I often struggle with, right? Because we talk about transformation and we think we're all are saying the same thing, where sometimes we might be looking at a transformation at a team level. We might be looking at a transformation at a program level. It might be at the leadership level. Which aspect of the organization we're going to focus on and transform has different techniques and processes. Maybe the same model applies, right? Where there is a sense of urgency, there is leadership and coalition, there is defining success, no matter which one you're in, but what you come out with is different depending on which one you're focusing on.
Oh, yeah. I think it's a good point. And you got me thinking too, right? Because we started the conversation about organizational change, and you've seen situations where the transformation was at the local level, but the other parts of the organization weren't on board. So now you're hindered, right, in how far you can take that. I agree. There's different things we have to account for. One of them is how far can you take that transformation at that local level before you start bumping into obstacles that need to be overcome.
Absolutely.
Then we get into the actual action part of things, right? According to Carter, then we're getting into engaging, and that includes communicating with the rest of the organization, empowering the individuals and the teams, and then the one that we all love, and that's creating quick wins, right? How we tend to operate it in iterative form in Agile, because our minds are sort of wired that way at this point. I think that's my favorite one, at least, right? So what do those three look like to you in your environment when you're engaging organizations?
I'll say for me, my number one that I think touches probably on all three of those is to use a contest. So we've had some success where first, I think we know, Cotter talks about using a volunteer army. And I'm huge on that. Trying to get people to change who are not ready to change is absolutely painful. And probably, I'm sure it can be done, but I have no idea how to do it. So to first say to executives, look, here's our messaging, here's why we want to change. We'd like you leaders who think you might be ready to apply. And what you're applying for is a certain level of coaching support, a certain level of maybe tool support, a certain level of traditional change management support. And we will hold up your lessons learned to the rest of the company, right? We're going to celebrate what we learn, and we're going to look to use that to build out larger wins across the company. So maybe you get, we have some criteria for who's allowed to apply, right? Or what a great project might look like. That would be a good fit, or a great product line or product. We take the applications, we score them, we get back, and there's some winners. And then we provide some key staff to those winners to help them launch teams, to build baseline metrics, right? That's part of that as well. So we can see, to Peter, to your point earlier, we can see how much change goes on. And we start by not boiling the ocean. We take those leaders, because they are so critical, who are ready to try the change. We give them what they need to be successful. I say to do Agile done right. And then we measure, we learn, we build a reference model, and then we expand that out to the organization, maybe through a couple different waves.
Yeah, I love how you introduced that term of volunteer army in there, right? These set of individuals that would normally not be looked at in title, but might be those natural servant leaders that want to get engaged, that want to be a part of it. Yeah.
Ernesto, you mentioned earlier about communication. So what's the you use the word vision, right? What's the purpose of this? Why are we doing this? And come back and revisit it, like every year, right? To make sure that that statement still is up to date, it's still clear, makes sense. There's oftentimes a disconnect between what the executive team is thinking they want to achieve, and then what the people actually doing the work, what they think, right, is going on. I would also want to. So Dave, the volunteers. I want to understand what's negotiable and what's not negotiable. So I'm going to use a more traditional term, some agile governance, right? Like, what's the minimum? So, for example, one organization says, "Hey, we're trying to become more agile. Here's some options for you. You can use Scrum, you can use Kanban," and they list things out. My experience has shown that isn't as helpful as they think it would be, because then you end up with factions. Unfortunately, I haven't seen better cases of that. I'm sure they're out there. Maybe the organization says, "Hey, at a minimum, these are the things we expect of you. We expect you to iterate. We expect you to be on a team," things like that. And all the other stuff, wide open. Right? That's for you to choose. But we want to be clear, we're moving in this direction. And we need you to come along with us. So still some minimum expectations, so you don't have people bucking the system, right?
Yeah, and I'll say, at least with my clients, that comes up a lot. That's maybe the first objection, is well, what about those people who don't want to do this, right? They're coming along whether they want to or not. And I'll be honest, I'm not sure I've seen a great way how to handle that. My hope is, and my approach has been, let's start small. Let's not boil the ocean. Let's take those people who are ready first.
Yeah.
And then hopefully we show enough compelling evidence that, we talk about change fatigue, that people who have been through 10 different change programs in the past, they actually see some results on a small scale in this one before they're ready to buy in, right? Because if you've been for any company for a long period of time, you've been through reorgs that are supposed to improve, or Lean Six Sigma, or Lean Startup. There's all kinds of TQM. There's been so many things that a lot of these folks have seen over the years that they didn't see as paying dividends. So I don't know. My hope is showing them some of that will help bring a lot more along. But I think you're right. At some point, my hope is it's just far into the future. At some point, you've built enough of momentum through those quick wins, through seeing real value, that 80–90% of your staff are ready to come along. Now,
that number. Okay, finish. I want to pick up on that when you're done, if you don't mind, Dave.
No, absolutely. No, how to handle that last 10–20%, I think is a huge issue. My hope is there's still a place for them, whether it be just somewhere else in the organization. But, you know, I think we've all heard of firms that tend to churn, you know, the bottom, what they view as the bottom 5–10% of their workforce every year. And that might be a piece of it. So please jump in, Peter.
Yeah, Dave, you saw I connected right with you on that one too. Ernesto, can I ask one last question as a wrap up? Is that okay? My question is for you two. When you go through a transformation, you can expect to lose 10% of your people specifically related to the transformation. Is that an acceptable loss or unacceptable loss? Go.
It's a great question. It's a brave question. So I'll give you a brave answer. I would say yes is a short answer. Now that has a lot of considerations, of course, right? A acceptable loss is when a person is not a good fit for the mindset that the transformation requires, right? An unacceptable loss is when that person did not go through the proper coaching or the proper mentoring to be given the opportunity to adapt and be a successful contributor. Okay?
Yeah, I like that answer a lot. As much as I hate saying there's any acceptable loss, I think for any company, you know, I think about it, take it back in some ways as you transform. At the end of that, in some ways you could look at it as I've started a new company and my company has new values and principles. And the old values and principles that I used to hire my old workforce no longer applies. So I wouldn't hire those same people today. So I give them an opportunity to see if we can find a fit for them. But if I can't, you know, in some ways you look at it as very much, they no longer represent the values, principles, way of working that we started with. So this probably is not the best fit for them anymore.
Excellent answers. I will give my short reply, which is people leave the company when we change the health insurance plan. So it shouldn't surprise us that
I love that.
we change how we work. Yeah, good answers. Thank you, guys.
I mean, I'll say before we wrap it up, Peter, maybe that's a key as well, though, in terms of setting expectations with executives. Because I sense when they come into these, quote, agile transformations or any other transformation, they just don't have a really good idea of what to expect. How much is it going to cost, right? What do I expect? You mean I'm going to lose people as we go through this? I mean, need to reskill people as well. Oof. Now this is starting to sound expensive and scarier than it did when it was just, hey, I've heard about this agile transformation thing. I think we should get on board that bandwagon.
Well, and that might be a good segue into our next session, right? I've had actual conversations. Peter, I know we've been in some together where the organization doesn't want to call it a transformation because it's too disruptive, right? So understanding what they're in for and committing to it being a positive disruption is a key element to making this work. Okay. All right. We are 6 minutes over, but we can't help it. We love geeking out on this stuff. Thank you, gentlemen. See you back in the next session.
See you guys.